Greetings, this is Greg. What was the best fighter bomber of the Second World War? It's a bit tough to say, but if the emphasis is on the bomber part of the equation, it's probably the de Havilland Mosquito FB Mark 6. There are some serious challengers for the title of best fighter bomber. While not officially designated as such, nearly every U.S. fighter was a fighter bomber, and some were quite good in both roles. In a previous video, I compared the Mosquito FB6 with Lockheed's P-38G Lightning. The G model is a mid-1942 to mid-1943 model. It's a good airplane, but has far less capability than the later P-38J or subsequent versions. The Mosquito equivalent of the 38G is the FB6 with Merlin 21 engines and running a maximum of 9 pounds of boost. In 1942, both of these planes were running on 100-octane fuel. So I think these are the best two versions of these planes for comparative purposes. Before we continue, I do want to clarify something. The Mosquito FB6 is a legitimate fighter bomber. In the comments section of previous videos, quite a few people have said that the Mosquito is not a fighter and arguing that it's thus somehow unfair to compare it to the P-38. That's simply false. That is the part about the Mosquito not being a fighter. Of course, some versions of the Mosquito were not fighters, but some were. For example, the F Mark II was a pure fighter version and could not carry bombs. It's not a night fighter either. The F Mark II is a day fighter. The F stands for fighter. Mosquito designations were pretty simple. F for fighter, NF for night fighter, B for bomber, PR for photo reconnaissance, and of course FB fighter bomber. The Mosquito was initially designed with bomber specifications in mind, but with features giving a greater range of capabilities than a typical bomber design. And that was recognized from very early on. When the plane was first authorized for mass production, 245 examples were ordered. Of those 245, how many do you think were bombers? I suspect that most people think the majority were bombers, but that's not the case. The numbers break down like this: 19 reconnaissance planes, 50 bombers, and 176 fighters. So yes, the Mosquito was absolutely a fighter and was understood to be a fighter and ordered that way from very early on. Of course, soon it became apparent that a fighter-bomber version would be more useful, but that was true of just about every fighter in the war, which is part of the reason I chose the Mosquito FB6 for comparison with the P-38G, and again, that FB literally stands for fighter-bomber. Today, we're talking about these planes in the bomber and ground attack roles. Spoiler alert, the Mosquito has the overall advantage here as a bomber, but not for the reasons most people seem to think. In fact, for a while, as we go through the data, it's going to seem like the P-38 has the upper hand in this contest. But it really doesn't, and you'll see why. Before we get to all that, I want to mention that I have coffee/tea mugs for sale. I have tried this before on this channel, but maintaining quality with certain vendors was a problem. That's why I'm now using the Zazzle store. It's more expensive, but they're really nice. I also commissioned an artist to make the pictures. I used a Mosquito FB6 because, of course, that's the focus of this video. So the specs on the cup are from 1942, but I like the way it looks with D-Day invasion stripes, so that's what we have here. Also, it's available in either right or left-handed versions, which has to do with the side the image is on. I didn't realize that was something people think about, but my wife is left-handed, and she has informed me that it is. Anyway, link in the description, which is here. Back to our video. Starting with speed, this shows the speed of a P-38 without bombs at maximum power and maximum continuous power. Ironically, in this case, the P-38's maximum power isn't really the published maximum power because when the engine's actually in the airplane, it's limited by the carburetor air temperature. It can actually run either of these two power settings I have graphed here with no time limits. Now I'll add in a P-38G with 2,200 pounds of bombs, meaning two 1,100-pound bombs. This slows it down quite a bit. These numbers are for max continuous power, and it's down to 295 miles an hour at sea level and has a max speed of 360 miles an hour at 25,000 feet, which is actually pretty fast for a plane carrying this kind of bomb load. There is no data for the P-38G at max power with a bomb load, but it would probably be about 10 miles per hour faster everywhere. I should add that this is a slightly different data set for both airplanes than I used in earlier videos. It's more complete, but the speeds are slightly lower at some points. Now let's add in the Mosquito. Unfortunately, there are no tests of a 1942 FB6, so I have to substitute in something. In the last video, I used a Mark IV bomber variant because it had the correct engine, and I didn't think the gun nose would slow the plane down all that much. Wow, was I wrong about that. It turns out the gun nose slows down the Mosquito a lot. So now I'm subbing in a pure fighter version, the F Mark II, but there are no tests of this plane with 1942 power levels. So here is the speed of an early 1944 Mosquito fighter variant running at 12 pounds of boost. This is a time-limited power setting. I don't have the actual time limit. I could not find it, but for reference, at 9 pounds of boost, these planes were limited to 1 hour of use at that setting. I suspect 12 psi is also good for an hour, but could have been as short as 15 minutes. Either way, at 12 psi, the fighter variant of the Mosquito is clearly faster than a P-38 carrying bombs running at max continuous power. An internal bomb load probably won't slow the FB6 down much as compared with the F Mark II. I suspect those bomb bay doors on the Mark VI fit really well and seal up nicely. It's going to knock off some speed, but probably very little. I don't want to speculate on it, so I'm just going to ignore that variable and use the speeds straight from the F Mark II. Now, let's put in the Mosquito's cruise speed. The only cruise speed data we have for this plane is with only 4 pounds of boost, which is relatively low power, and a lean mixture, but it can run this setting all day long. Running this way, it's off-scale slow, 280 miles an hour at 6,000 feet, and quite a bit slower at sea level. However, this is a really low power setting, more for economy than speed. There is just no way to get a perfect apples-to-apples comparison here. We have to use a pure fighter version of the Mosquito, which can't carry bombs, versus a P-38 that can, and the Mosquito is running 1944 power versus the P-38's 1942 power level. Worse, we don't have max speed data for the P-38 with bombs, only data for max continuous power. But that gives me an idea. I might be going about this the wrong way. Instead of trying to find the maximum speeds, let's compare them both at about the same lower cruise power settings. So let's start a whole new graph with the Mosquito at this weaker power setting. Here we go. Now let's add in the P-38 with 2,200 pounds of bombs at a similar power setting. The P-38 here, depending on altitude, is running between 31 and 35 inches of manifold pressure. That's about 1 psi up to about 2.5 psi. In terms of actual horsepower, the P-38 here is running around 740 per side, the Mosquito around 900. That P-38 number of 740 is from the pilot's manual, but for the Mosquito I had to calculate it, but it's probably pretty close. The next power setting in the P-38's manual is one setting higher, 41 inches of manifold pressure, which works out to about 5.5 psi and 1,100 horsepower. This is max continuous, and we saw it earlier. It puts the P-38 out way ahead. I know this goes against stuff I said in the earlier video, but then I was using the Mark IV bomber variant for speed. That gun nose on the Mosquito knocks off every bit of 20 miles per hour in speed, which is surprising to me, but that's what it does. When you factor that in, by using the Mosquito fighter variant, which I'll mention again can't even carry bombs, and look at the actual power settings used in 1942, there's only one conclusion possible, and it's a surprising one. The P-38, even when carrying 2,200 pounds of bombs, is faster than the Mosquito FB6. The only example I could come up with where a Mosquito with guns was faster was by looking at a pure fighter variant of the Mosquito from 44 without bombs and comparing it to a P-38 with bombs and running 1942 power settings. Not only is the P-38 a little faster on the way in while it's carrying bombs, it's a whole lot faster on the way out once the bombs have been dropped. Of course, speed isn't everything, so let's move on. Bomb load here, in terms of weight, favors the P-38 as well with its 2,200 pound capacity. However, the Mosquito FB6 is darn close. It can carry 2,000 pounds of bombs, 1,000 in the internal bomb bay, and a 500 pounder out on each wing. It's hard to say what's better, twin 1,100 pounders or 4 500 pounders. I suppose it depends on what type of target you're going after. On that subject, I want to be clear that the bomber version of the Mosquito, not the fighter bomber we're talking about here, but the straight-up bomber-only version, can carry 4 500-pound bombs internally. However, the fighter bomber cannot. Its 4 20-millimeter cannons take up about the first half of that bomb bay. In fact, the forward bomb bay doors on the FB6 are only there to service the cannon, so I even hesitate to call them bomb bay doors. Yes, I have seen this picture. Quite a few of you have sent it to me, and I've seen it before. It shows an FB6 with a trolley holding 4 500-pound bombs. Some people are looking at this photo and concluding that those 4 bombs are going into that bomb bay. That's not what the photo shows, and that's not what's happening. I don't know what is happening in this picture. It could have been a photo op for publicity purposes, propaganda, or maybe armorers are just being efficient. After they put 2 bombs into this plane's bomb bay, they're taking their trolley to the next plane and loading up the other 2. It's possible all 4 are going onto this airplane, but if so, 2 of them are going to be mounted externally on the wings. That bomb bay is so tight that even 2 of the normal 500-pounders don't quite fit. The plane carried a special short-tailed version of the 500-pound bomb to carry internally. So in terms of total bomb load, the P-38 actually has a slight edge here. Furthermore, in order to carry 2,000 pounds of bombs, the Mosquito has to sacrifice speed from the drag of the external payload. We're going to have to talk about bombing accuracy because this comes up a lot in the comments section. There's a lot of speculation out there, but there's actually very little data regarding bombing accuracy of either one of these airplanes, or of fighter bombers during the war in general. People suggest that the Mosquito had amazingly accurate bomb delivery, and usually back this up by comparing it to the US B-17. Now, I don't want to drift too far off topic here, but US B-17s bombing visually from altitude put about 20% of their bombs within 1,000 feet of their aiming point. Considering that these are planes in a formation, and further considering the size of that formation, I think that's pretty good. That 20% number is from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, which also notes that accuracy got as high as 70% of the bombs hitting within 1,000 feet of the aiming point late in the war. If the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey is not good enough for you, this PhD thesis from the Department of War Studies at King's College gives more specific numbers and a timeline with references. Neither the Mosquito nor the P-38 can match this level of accuracy from altitude, certainly not the FB6 or P-38G. The accuracy comparisons of the Mosquito versus B-17 seem to be based on the Mosquito bombing at low altitude versus the B-17 up high. Of course, that's a question of usage, more correctly a comparison of bombing at low altitude versus high altitude, not really a comparison of aircraft. I think this misconception that the B-17 was horribly inaccurate comes from the British night bombing accuracy number that's constantly thrown around, which is 51%, which sounds a lot higher than the B-17's 20%. However, this comparison ignores the fact that the British standards were based on hitting the city. So 49% of the bombs the British were dropping at night were hitting the countryside, missing the city entirely. And that number is based on the Butt Report, which was early in the war, and their numbers got a little bit better over time, but the British night bombing never approached U.S. daylight visual bombing in terms of accuracy, which should not be a surprise. The actual surprise is how often this misconception comes up. Back to the Mosquito. Is it accurate? In terms of accuracy, the Mosquito FB6 is just another fighter bomber. Same with the P-38G. They don't have any special equipment or tricks up the sleeve to be any more accurate than any other fighter bomber of the war. This is before the age of smart or guided weapons that are commonly integrated in with the aircraft systems. As with most other fighter bombers, the weapons delivered by the Mosquito FB6 and P-38G relied on pilot skill for accuracy and not much else. I suppose one could argue that the P-38's counter-rotating props will make the job of gunnery, bombing, and rocket attacks, or anything else, a little bit more accurate. The Mosquito pilot has to deal with those asymmetrical propeller forces when lining up on the target. This isn't really a big deal, but it's not exactly nothing either. On the other hand, the Mosquito may benefit from the second crew member. He can't improve accuracy, that's on the pilot, but he can improve situational awareness and help to find and identify targets. There really isn't anything to choose between these two planes in terms of accuracy in low-level tactical type bombing, which is really the only type of bombing either one can do effectively. For that matter, if we threw the F-4U Corsair, P-51 Mustang, or the FW-190A8 into the mix, they would all be about the same in this regard as well. It was all up to the pilot. There really isn't much data out there in terms of bombing accuracy with fighter-bomber type airplanes from World War II. We do have some Marine Corps studies, but they don't really deal with accuracy exactly. They deal with proximity to friendly troops. The U.S. Marines were very focused on close air support, really close, and their data reflects that. For example, if dropping 100-pound bombs, they could normally attack targets within 100 yards of friendly troops. In an emergency, within 75 yards. 100 yards is about 91 meters. Considering that a 100-pound bomb has some meaningful blast radius within which it can injure friendly troops, and I don't have exact numbers for that, but it seems that U.S. fighter bombers would had to have been accurate within about 25 meters in terms of both azimuth and range. As with naval gunfire, low-altitude bombing is more accurate in azimuth than in range. Thus, it's much easier to hit a tall target like a ship, a building, or a high wall, because if you drop a little bit too late, the extra distance will simply mean you hit up higher on the target, but it's still a hit. Bombing a small target is disproportionately difficult, especially if it's moving. Yet fighter bombers hit small targets all the time. According to the Smithsonian, the P-47 Thunderbolt alone destroyed 68,000 trucks. It's not broken down by weapon type, and of course the Thunderbolt used rockets and machine guns as well, but I think it's safe to say that a fair portion of that 68,000 was from bombs. After all, they kept putting bombs on the airplane through the entire war, so they must have been contributing. There is no reason to think that the Mosquito FB6 was any more accurate when bombing than the P-38 or any other fighter bomber, nor do any records support that. About now, someone is starting to type, what about the Amiens prison raid? That proves how amazingly accurate the Mosquito was. I know someone's typing this because it comes up in the comments all the time, so I'll preemptively cover it. The Amiens prison raid, hopefully I'm saying that right, was in February of 1944. It was a mission to bomb a prison and free the prisoners inside. This required the participating Mosquito FB6s to hit the prison wall and the building inside in an effort to free the prisoners, which they did. If you want to talk about the bravery of the crews or the difficulty of the mission, I'm right there with you. But if you want to try to say that hitting a tall prison wall or a large building is by World War II fighter bomber standards some great display of bombing accuracy, I think you're just unaware of how common it was for fighter bombers to hit much smaller targets and much more difficult targets, often targets actively moving to try to avoid being hit and targets that are shooting back. The other FB6 mission that comes up a lot in a vain attempt to prove accuracy was the March of 1945 mission against Gestapo headquarters in Denmark. Yes, they did hit the building and destroy it. Again, it's a big and obviously very stationary building, so stop saying this is some miracle of accuracy. It isn't. Also, this isn't the best example to bring up, as mosquitoes also hit a nearby school, killing 105 people inside, 87 of them children. But since this keeps coming up, and now I've mentioned it, I have to talk about it. Hitting the school was a case of what we now call confirmation bias, and not the result of a technical limitation of accuracy. The school was 1.5 kilometers away from the Gestapo headquarters, the actual target. That's about 1 mile. What happened was that a mosquito hit a lamppost and then crashed into the school, catching it on fire. The next wave of mosquitoes, expecting to see the target on fire from the previous wave, then seeing the school on fire, mistook it for the target. It's a solid case of confirmation bias combined with the fog of war. War is hell, and apparently there's a recent movie about this event, but I've not seen it. The Mosquito FB6 was no more, no less accurate than any other World War II fighter bomber, at least not a typical fighter bomber. But where the Mosquito does have a big advantage is in long-range bombing missions, and not only because of the aircraft range, although that's what I'm going to cover next. The P-38G version of the Lightning, like all early Lightnings, does not carry a whole lot of internal fuel, 306 gallons. With bombs on board, its range is not great. As a very general rule, if you want to find the combat radius of an airplane, you can take its air miles per gallon at a given speed and multiply that by the number of gallons on board at the start of the flight, and then divide that by 3. We divide it by 3 because we need to go to the target and back, plus have some more fuel for startup, taxi, takeoff, time over the target, fuel reserves, and so on. This method works pretty well. Again, it's not perfect, but as I'll do it the same way for both airplanes, it's certainly solid for comparative purposes. At low altitudes, down below radar, running at max continuous power with 2,200 pounds of bombs on board, the P-38 will be at a true airspeed of 300 miles per hour, but with a range of only 130 miles. That's enough for a dash from England over into Normandy and back, but that's about all. Now, if you want to slow the plane down to 260 miles an hour, then you can go out 191 miles. And you can get this up to 325 miles if you want to slow the plane all the way down to 180 miles per hour, but that will probably require operating in an area where your team has air superiority. But remember, this is on internal fuel with 2,200 pounds of bombs and at a very low altitude to stay below radar. Obviously, these numbers could be a lot higher under other more ideal conditions. Let's add in the range of the Mosquito with a 1,000-pound bomb load, so half the P-38's load in this case. The Mosquito manual does not have the same amount of data and detail that we find in the Lightning manual. It only gives data for one cruise speed on the deck, which is 221 miles per hour. The Mosquito FB6 normally holds 452 imperial gallons of fuel internally, that's 543 US gallons, far more than the P-38G. Thus, at 221 miles per hour on the deck, this plane can range out 392 miles. At the plane's maximum speed of 305 miles per hour down low, range is obviously a lot less, but it can take that load to a target 240 miles away. That's based on my own calculations, as the Mosquito manual just gives shockingly little information about fuel consumption at various power settings. My estimation is close, though. I used data from a Spitfire at similar power settings, simply doubled the fuel flow. Obviously, you can mix and match power settings here as well. For example, you might want to throttle back on the way in to save fuel and then run at very high speed for the return flight, the dash back to safety, so to speak. Now we can add in drop tanks, which changes things a bit. The P-38 can carry 300-gallon drop tanks, 2 of them, but then it can't carry any bombs. What it can do is fly with an asymmetrical load, a single drop tank on one side and an 1,100-pound bomb on the other. At max continuous power with this setup, it can run at 290 miles per hour on the way to the target with a range of about 251 miles. If slowed down to 170 miles an hour, it can range out to about 500 miles. The Mosquito can add in another 240 US gallons via drop tanks. With this setup, it can still take its 1,000-pound internal load and easily fly to a target 600, even 650 miles away and get all the way back. Either plane could reach Berlin with 1,000 pounds of bombs, but the Mosquito has the advantage here in that it can range with that payload farther, and it can take 2,000 pounds, 390 miles, which the P-38 can't do. The range advantage here clearly goes to the Mosquito. One big advantage of the Mosquito is that it also carries a navigator who can take advantage of the plane's navigational equipment. One piece of such equipment is the Mosquito's drift meter. This is normally found in medium bombers or larger, and I don't know of any other fighter bomber so equipped. In all the Mosquito books and videos I've read and watched, I've never seen this mentioned, which is a shame because it's important, and it really helps explain why and how the Mosquitoes could perform some of its missions when other fighter bombers could not. The drift meter allows the Mosquito's navigator to keep the plane on course to a distant target independently, meaning without the need to receive signals from ground-based navigational aids. He can also do this with very few references to visual landmarks. In the daytime, the Mosquito's crew will normally navigate one of 2 ways, more often a combination of the 2. The first method is called pilotage, which is simply navigating from one visible landmark to the next, and so on until you reach your destination. If flying in an unfamiliar area, this usually involves studying the shapes of prominent things, large cities, lakes, coastlines, really anything that's easily identifiable from the air. A good World War II example is Dummer Lake in Germany. It's about 35 miles southwest of Bremen, and is constantly referenced in reports from U.S. pilots. Positions are often referenced as being either over Dummer Lake or some distance and bearing from Dummer Lake, probably because this was commonly used as a visual reference for navigation. It certainly makes sense. The second method of navigation related to this talk is dead reckoning. Let's say that from Dummer Lake, the next leg of your journey takes you to Hanover. But today you can't see Hanover from Dummer Lake, either because of your low altitude or if you're up higher just because of poor visibility. Not really a problem. You know the heading to Hanover, and you know how far it is and how fast you're going. So if in no wind conditions you hold your proper heading, you should reach Hanover at the predicted time. The complication is wind. If the wind speed and direction are known, the crew can compensate for it. If the wind is blowing the plane to the right, of course, the pilot will simply hold a heading some amount to the left, and it will be some calculated amount. The heading needed and the resulting change in ground speed, and thus the time to the checkpoint, were typically calculated on what was called a flight computer, an E6B, which was just a specialized slide rule specifically for this purpose. Now, people skilled with these things can use them really well, about as fast as an electronic calculator. So far, this is pretty easy, and for the most part, it works pretty well. For many decades, this was how pilots navigated, and if you were flying across the United States, even in 1942, you had pretty accurate wind forecasting, so your pre-flight planning would account for the winds, and your planned headings would work out just fine. Flying across Germany in 1942 was another matter. Forecast and observed wind data over Germany or over the vast expanses of water that airplanes flew over was unreliable for the Allies. A Mosquito crew tasked with flying deep into Germany at low altitude on a day with, say, 5 miles of visibility wouldn't have great wind data and would not be able to use pilotage very effectively due to the short line of sight distance to the next checkpoint. Imagine trying to do this over water where there are no checkpoints, and Mosquitoes did this all the time. So how did the Mosquito crews handle this? Well, they used the drift meter. This is one from a U.S. airplane. I don't have a picture of the one used in the Mosquito, but the principle is the same. This device allows the navigator to determine the difference between the airplane's heading and true airspeed as compared to its actual track and speed over the ground. With that data, he can give the pilot correct heading information and estimated times to the next checkpoint or target. This allows the Mosquito crew to navigate with a very high degree of accuracy over longer distances than any other fighter bomber in the war that I know of, certainly better than any single-seater. The drift meter also works over water and allows planes so equipped to navigate to islands or to locations of ships at sea independent of ground-based navigational aids. In short, the Mosquito can go farther with a bomb load and has a very good chance of finding a distant target as compared with the P-38. The Mosquito also has a radio direction finding system. This uses a loop antenna to get the bearing to a transmitting station. Of course, it's somewhat range limited, but based on the direction to a station, the navigator can determine the plane's bearing from the station. This is useful for not only finding your way back to the station, it can be used to intercept and track a specific course from it, allowing the crew to combine that with time to get a rough idea of their position. They can also use multiple stations to triangulate their position. Thus, the Mosquito FB6 can bomb cities at night or in bad weather with very little visibility. This won't be accurate by any means, and accuracy is, of course, going to decrease a lot with the range from the station, but it could be done, especially if the objective was to bomb something big like a city and not too far from friendly transmitting stations in the British Isles. In summary, these two planes are pretty close as a bomber in terms of short-range daylight operations. If your goal is to support advancing ground forces, then there isn't too much to choose between the P-38G and the Mosquito FB Mark 6. In that case, bases will tend to move forward with the advancements, so the P-38 short range won't really come into effect. However, if your objective involves bombing targets a long way from base, in bad weather, or at night, or a long distance out over the water, the Mosquito is not only a better choice than the P-38, it's really the only choice among World War II fighter bombers. That's all I have for now. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe. Consider joining my Patreon. Goodbye, and have a great day. Oh, just one more quick thing. I want to mention the artist who I used for this video. His name is Spacer. He did not ask me to mention him, but I just think I should. He's doing work for various channels, not only mine, and I like his style of work. It sort of mixes realistic depictions with sort of that Saturday morning cartoon look. Some of you out there may be old enough what I'm talking about here. I think it helps to break up the mix of those same old black and white photos we've all seen time and time again. And the pictures look great on coffee mugs and other items as well. Again, please check the link in the video description. Goodbye and have a great day.